This is new section. In this section, we're going to talk about MVC controllers. If we go back to one of our early diagrams, let's go back to, I think, lesson number 2. We have this rectangle here that includes a lot of endpoint handling technologies. We have covered a lot about minimal API endpoint handling technologies. And starting from this section, we're going to talk about MVC endpoint handling technology. So again, let's go back to our new diagram here. What and why we use controllers. So what are controllers and why we use controllers? Controllers basically provide us with another way to create endpoints. So a controller is a class, like a container, which groups related endpoints together. So we no longer need to write static methods. Instead, we're using more structured C# feature, like a class, to create endpoint handlers. So let's jump into Visual Studio and try to create a very basic controller. Let's go to Visual Studio and let's go to create a new project. I'm going to select ASP.NET Core empty again and click on next. Solution name, I'm going to say learn MVC controllers, and the web project, the project is going to be web app again. Click on next. And we're going to uncheck this and click on create. So this very basic templates that we are going to get in a moment is basically based on minimal API. So let's go to program.cs and we can see that we have this map get, which so far, which at this point we're very familiar with. But instead of using this, let's use controllers. And let's start by creating a folder, because typically we're going to have multiple controllers in our project. And therefore, we are going to create a controllers folder. And then under that, we are going to create different classes that represent individual controllers. So when you click on the add button, you can see that we have this controller right here. Instead of using this, I'm going to just use a regular C# class. And that way you can learn about controllers and MVC in general from scratch. So let's create a controller that handles endpoints and handles requests that are related with departments. So therefore, I'm going to say department and then followed by controller. So typically a controller class will end with the word controller. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about the routing. But this is the convention. So we have a suffix for a controller class. And the front part is what this controller is about. So we're talking about departments. Therefore, we say departments and then followed by the suffix controller. Add button. All right, so we have a very plain C# class here. And this is what we call a controller. And in order to create an endpoint, we just need to create a simple C# function or a method. For example, let's create something, get department, and let's just return some hard-coded string. So I'm going to say these are, so I'm going to do this for now. And perhaps we can have multiple of them. Okay, so I'm going to have a get department by ID. I'm going to have the ID passed in, and then I'm going to return another string and say, I think I misspelled it. So department by ID, and then I'm going to say department info that is related to the ID, and then I'm going to use string interpolation here and finish with a semicolon. Okay, so this is very basic C# class with two functions here. The first one just return a simple string. Second one also return a simple string with interpolation and passing the ID. So we can use this simple class to handle request, and we can map requests to either this method or this method. So basically these methods are endpoint handlers. In the MVC technology, we call this the controller, and instead of calling these endpoint handlers, we usually call these action methods. Okay, so we have an action method and we have another action method, but they are actually endpoint handlers. So an action method is a endpoint handler, which means that it receives request from the client and it processes the request and eventually returns a response. So here we're returning response. In a controller, any public method or public functions is considered as a endpoint handler, unless you use the no action attribute. So for example, if you create something like this, right, and let's just return ABC, and you don't want this to become a endpoint handler or an action method, then you use something that is called non-action. And you can see, you can read comments here. It says indicates that a controller method is not an action method, meaning that this is not going to be a endpoint handler and it's not going to handle a request and return a response. Now let's talk about why we need MVC controllers if we already have minimal APIs, right? Because we have spent a lot of energy learning about minimal APIs. Why do we need MVC controllers? Well, first of all, it's a different technology. Right? I've just showed you the diagram in the second tab here. Right? We have different technologies. We have MVC reserved pages. We just learned minimal API because it is the most basic way to create endpoint handlers, and it's very easy to approach ASP.NET Core with learning about minimal APIs. But now we need to learn about MVC and reserved pages. The first reason is that MVC was originally there when ASP.NET was first created by Microsoft. So you're going to see a lot of MVC projects still there today. Even new projects are created with MVC. It's still a very popular technology. Right? And later you're going to learn about reserved pages. It's going to do the same thing as MVC, but with a different way. So the thing with ASP.NET Core is that it provides you with different ways to do the same thing. And it's up to you to choose which one you like, right? That's the first reason. It's a historical reason. And secondly, MVC is not only used for creating APIs, right? So these endpoints are not going to be just API endpoints. MVC can also return HTMLs. In turn, it creates very fancy user interface for the user, right? You have seen that we could create custom results that implement the iResult interface in minimal API technology and still return HTML, but you have to hardcode those HTML, right? With MVC or reserved pages, you can use the framework to create the front-end UI for you. You don't have to hardcode HTML anymore. So that's perhaps the most important reason why you need to learn MVC. And the third reason would be like a personal preference. For example, I do think that controllers provide us with a more structured way to create endpoints. However, I also do think that minimal APIs are more intent-driven. So it is very easy to look at a group of minimal API endpoints and know the intents other than looking at MVC controllers, because MVC controllers are relying on conventions a lot. So MVC is more structured, but although minimal API is not as structured as MVC or reserved pages, but minimal API is displaying the intent clearly. It's more obvious. So whether you prefer using MVC or a minimal API when you create a new project, it's really up to you. But if you're dealing with a legacy application that use MVC, then you have to learn MVC. And also, if you prefer the structure, then you use MVC. Or if you want to create some user interface, instead of just providing API endpoints, then you also use MVC. So that's some of the reasons why you need to learn MVC controllers in this chapter. And that's everything I want to cover in this video. And starting from next video, we're going to learn the different aspects of MVC controllers.